During the reign of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, the Roman Empire seemed invincible, a machine of conquest and territorial integration that through military strength and diplomacy absorbed peoples, cultures and lands throughout the Mediterranean basin. The northern frontier, marked by the mighty Rhine River, emerged as the next and inevitable boundary to be crossed. On one side, the Roman provinces of Gaul and Raetia, already integrated into the imperial administrative and military system, thrived under the order and prosperity of the Pax Romana. On the other, stretched the vast, dense and untamed Germanic forest, home to scattered tribes, proudly independent and fiercely resistant to foreign domination. Germania represented for Rome more than just a territory to be subdued. It was a symbol. Conquering it would mean extending Roman civilization to the edges of the known world, bringing Latin language, Roman law, roads and aqueducts, urban planning, currency, and the very idea of a universal empire. For Augustus, whose foreign policy combined prudence and ambition, transforming Germania into a province would crown his vision of a secure and cohesive empire, establishing a natural frontier in the Elbe valleys, and perhaps even beyond. In the years leading up to the catastrophe of Teutoburg, Rome undertook successive military campaigns in the region. Generals such as Drusus, the brother of Tiberius, led deep expeditions beyond the Rhine, establishing forts and outposts, subjugating tribes, and imposing client treaties. Between the years 12 and 9 before Christ, Drusus achieved significant victories, consolidating the Roman presence and extending its dominion to the Weser River. After his premature death, command passed to Tiberius, who with equal efficiency continued the expansionist policy, forging alliances with local tribes and expanding military control. However, despite appearances of submission, the Germanic region was never fully pacified. The Germanic tribes, such as the Cherusci, Marcomanni, Chatti, and Bructeri, maintained their ancestral rivalries but shared a common trait: aversion to Roman rule. The absence of urban centers, the semi-nomadic lifestyle, the clan-based social organization, and the cult of individual and tribal freedom made the Germans especially resistant to Romanization. Even so, the imperial administration believed that over time, the presence of the legions and the construction of infrastructure would transform Germania, much like what had occurred with Gaul, which, decades earlier, had also appeared as a barbaric territory, but had been molded by Roman strength and cunning into a loyal and prosperous province. To consolidate this project, Rome sent to the region a governor with broad powers, Publius Quinctilius Varus. Of senatorial origin, with experience in the administration of eastern provinces, Varus carried with him the typically Roman vision of the cultural and political superiority of the empire. His mission was not only military, but above all, civilizing. To organize tax collection, establish Roman law, found cities, and transform Germania into a natural extension of imperial order. However, the scenario Varus encountered upon assuming his position was more complex than official reports suggested. Although they appeared loyal, many Germanic tribal chiefs harbored resentment and distrust towards Roman domination. The imposition of taxes and the attempt to undermine traditional power structures exacerbated these tensions, which silently accumulated in the dark, damp forests, far from the watchful eyes of Roman garrisons. While Rome dreamed of consolidating its frontier on the Elbe, the seeds of a deadly betrayal were germinating in the shadows of Germania. Among the apparent allies, one man stood out: Arminius, a prince of the Cherusci, educated in the Roman way, who knew intimately both the legionary tactics and the weaknesses of the empire's military and administrative apparatus. In the apparent stability of the Rhine frontier, there lay a silent prelude to one of the greatest military tragedies in Roman history, the ambush that would soon seal the fate of 3 entire legions and forever mark the eastern limit of imperial ambitions. At the turn of the era, the Roman army was considered the most efficient and disciplined military machine of the ancient world. Forged through centuries of expansionist wars, its power lay not only in brute strength, but above all, in its capacity for organization, adaptation, and discipline. The legions stationed in Germania, especially the 16th, 68th, and 99th, under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus, represented the apex of this military structure and were seen as the ultimate instrument to ensure the integration of the region into the empire. Yet operating beyond the Rhine in distant, hostile and unknown territories imposed challenges that not even Roman excellence could easily overcome. Each of the legions assigned to Germania counted on average about 5,000 men. Roman citizens intensively trained for close formation combat, masters in the use of the pilum, the gladius and the scutum. In addition to the legions themselves, the army included auxiliary troops, mostly composed of non-citizens from the provinces, specialized in complementary roles, light cavalry, archers, slingers and scouts. The presence of these mixed units was essential for adapting Roman tactics to the Germanic terrain, marked by dense forests, treacherous swamps, and an unpredictable climate. The command of operations rested with Varus, a competent administrator but lacking significant military experience. His general staff included veteran officers and tribunes well acquainted with the logistical and strategic difficulties of the region. The legions built and maintained military roads, the famous viae, that connected forts and advanced garrisons, facilitating troop movement and supply lines. Moreover, forts, castella, and fortified camps, castra, were meticulously erected, serving as points of support and refuge. These infrastructures were true oases of order and security amid the chaotic vastness of the Germanic forests. Despite the apparent solidity of the Roman presence, the challenges were immense. The geography of Germania, dominated by rolling hills, thick forests, and impassable waterways, hindered the application of traditional Roman tactics, which favored open-field combat in compact, well-coordinated lines. The climate also conspired against the invaders. Harsh winters, humid summers, and constant rains turned roads into quagmires and eroded equipment and structures. Beyond the natural factors, the human element presented even greater risks. The Germanic tribes, although often disunited, were expert connoisseurs of the terrain. They fought with guerrilla tactics, swift ambushes, and retreats to hard-to-reach locations. They were masters at using the environment as a weapon. Felled trees blocked paths. Ambushes were set up in narrow passages. Arrows and spears rained down on Roman columns, which, despite their discipline, could not respond effectively in such circumstances. Varus's strategy, however, remained faithful to the classical Roman model. Ostentatious patrolling, shows of force, alliances with tribal chiefs, and the imposition of Roman legal and fiscal systems. The governor underestimated the complexity of Germanic tribal alliances and ignored clear signs of growing discontent. Arminius, one of Rome's closest allies and commander of auxiliary troops, was seen as a pillar of the pacification policy, and his loyalty was never questioned by the Romans. Yet his influence over neighboring tribes and his intimate understanding of Roman mentality made him a potentially devastating adversary. As the legions deepened their presence in Germania, erecting fortifications, collecting taxes, and imposing the Pax Romana, tensions within the forests grew. Many tribal chiefs viewed collaboration with Rome as a betrayal of their ancestors and their Germanic gods. Reports indicate that in the weeks preceding the tragedy, signs of unrest were perceptible. Unusual tribal movements, disappearance of messengers, and minor attacks on isolated detachments. However, the unshakable confidence in Roman superiority and the belief in the inexorable success of the civilizing mission prevented Varus and his officers from considering the possibility of a large-scale conspiracy. The Roman military apparatus, despite its strength and sophistication, was unprepared for a conflict that would unfold under such unfavorable conditions. The long marching columns, composed not only of soldiers, but also civilians, merchants, enslaved individuals, and legionaries' families, advanced slowly through forest paths, carrying wagons with supplies, war machines, and gleaming standards. The metallic clatter of armor and the jingling of weapons echoed among the silent trees, unaware that above, hidden in the canopies, watchful eyes and silent enemies followed every step. While Rome bet on order, discipline, and the inevitability of imperial progress, the Germans prepared to subvert all these elements with the oldest and deadliest weapon, surprise. Thus, the most powerful legions in the world marched into a trap from which they would not return, confident that their own weight, their own tradition, and their very name would suffice to bend the will of any enemy. Among the many figures who marked the history of Rome, few had such a profound and lasting impact as Arminius, the Cheruscan prince who, with cunning, courage, and betrayal, led the ambush that culminated in the destruction of 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest. His trajectory is a fascinating portrait of the ambiguities of Roman politics, a man shaped by imperial civilization, who ultimately became its most formidable enemy. Arminius was born among the Cherusci, one of the Germanic tribes inhabiting the region beyond the Rhine, characterized by a segmented society, based on clans and local leaderships, united by ties of blood and tradition, but often divided by internal rivalries. From a young age, he stood out for his bravery, intelligence, and martial skill, attributes that caught the attention of the Romans. In line with Rome's practice of co-opting barbarian elites, Arminius was taken to Rome as a living symbol of the possible integration between the empire and barbarian peoples. In the imperial capital, Arminius received an excellent education, absorbing not only the Roman language and customs, but also the fundamentals of military art. Enlisted among the auxiliary troops, he served with distinction, earning Roman citizenship and the status of equestrian, a privilege reserved for the military nobility. This period of formation endowed Arminius with an intimate knowledge of the tactics, discipline, and vulnerabilities of the Roman legions, knowledge that would later be transformed into lethal weapons against his former masters. To the Romans, Arminius was the perfect example of the effectiveness of their policy of acculturation and loyalty, a Romanized barbarian prince, now a defender of imperial order in his homeland. Yet his privileged position concealed a latent tension between acquired loyalty and ancestral roots, between admiration for the grandeur of Rome and resentment for the humiliation of his people. This inner conflict matured silently as Arminius gained the absolute trust of Publius Quinctilius Varus and rose as one of the main intermediaries between Rome and the Germanic tribes. The political context of Germania at that time offered Arminius a singular opportunity. The local tribes, though formidable in combat, remained fragmented, unable to present a unified resistance to Roman expansion. Rome's strategy was precisely to exploit these divisions, establishing alliances with chiefs willing to collaborate and punishing rebels exemplarily. Arminius, with his noble lineage and military reputation, became a vital link in this network of political clientelism, often called upon to advise Varus on the moods and intentions of the tribes. Behind this facade of loyalty, Arminius patiently and skillfully wove the most elaborate of betrayals. Under the pretext of strengthening alliances, he traveled through the Germanic villages not as a Roman emissary, but as a conspirator, convincing tribal leaders that submission was intolerable and that a coordinated attack could, for the first time, liberate Germania from Roman presence. His proposal was audacious, a large-scale ambush that would destroy not an isolated detachment, but an entire corps of legions, shattering imperial confidence and forcing Rome to retreat definitively. Arminius's genius lay not only in the conception of the ambush, but also in the choice of its moment and location. He took advantage of Varus's complacency, who, confident in the region's stability, was preparing to move his troops to deal with a supposed localized revolt. Arminius was the messenger of this false insurrection, leading Varus into the dense forest where Roman mobility would be nullified and the numerical superiority of the legions rendered irrelevant. The Roman historian Tacitus, when recounting the subsequent events, described Arminius as the liberator of Germania, while other chroniclers emphasized his treacherous cunning and the perfidy of a man who had received Rome's favor only to turn against it. Thus, Arminius's figure became emblematic of the Roman dilemma in managing its provinces. To what extent was it possible to trust the loyalty of those who, though educated and Romanized, maintained deep and often irreducible cultural roots? For the Germans, Arminius would be eternized as a hero and liberator, for Rome as a symbol of its most painful betrayal. His ability to reconcile identity, strategy, and leadership made him not only the mastermind behind the Battle of Teutoburg, but also one of the most complex figures in ancient history, whose singular action irrevocably altered the destinies of both Rome and Germania. The prelude to one of the greatest military tragedies in Roman history began under the deceptive veil of administrative normality. Governor Publius Quinctilius Varus, faithful to his mission of consolidating order and extending Roman civilization in Germania, received reports from Arminius about an imminent insurrection to the east. supposedly orchestrated by distant and hostile tribes. Trusting blindly in his Cheruscan ally, and unaware of the deception hidden behind the information, Varus decided to move the bulk of his forces to suppress the rebellion. The plan seemed simple: a swift show of force, a return to camp, and another victory to be added to the imperial annals. Thus, at the end of the summer of the year 9th, after Christ, 3 full legions, the 17th, 14th, and 19th, accompanied by a significant number of auxiliary troops, civilians, families, and supplies, departed from their advanced base toward the interior of Germania. The Roman columns, heavy and slow, stretched for kilometers, winding along the narrow and damp trails that cut through the dense Teutoburg forest. The setting was inhospitable. Monumental trees blocked sunlight, the ground was soaked by recent rains, and the oppressive silence of the woods was broken only by the creaking of wagons, the snorting of pack animals, and the metallic echo of moving armor. Along the way, the army gradually fragmented, as was common when moving through difficult terrain. The legions that, in open field, formed human walls of shields and spears, now advanced in elongated columns, vulnerable and with little capacity for coordinated reaction. Roman tactical superiority, founded on discipline, cohesive formation, and maneuverability, was rendered useless by the hostile environment. Furthermore, Varus's overconfidence, having ordered no prior reconnaissance nor reinforced his vanguards, contributed to the weakening of the Roman position. The choice of route proved fatal. The Teutoburg forest, with its dense vegetation and rugged terrain, offered the Germans an ideal battlefield for guerrilla warfare. Every depression in the ground, every fallen trunk, every bend in the path was a potential ambush. And indeed, in the silent shadows, thousands of Germanic warriors waited, hidden and poised under the command of Arminius, who, after guiding Varus there, had quickly returned to his troops, ready to unleash the mortal blow. As the legions advanced, weather conditions deteriorated further. Strong winds blew through the treetops, causing branches to snap, and the sounds of nature to merge with the ominous prelude to impending violence. The incessant rain turned trails into quagmires, bogging down wagons and further slowing the march. The soldiers, exhausted, soaked, and demoralized by the sluggish pace and discomfort, trudged forward through an environment that seemed to conspire against their every step. Despite these signs, Varus and his commanders did not detect the trap closing around them. Their trust in Arminius's loyalty and the supremacy of the legions blinded them to the evidence. Small signs of unrest, the disappearance of guides, unusual movements among supposedly pacified tribes, and rumors among the auxiliaries were dismissed or interpreted as insignificant. The march continued, slow and inexorable, plunging deeper into the forest that, silent and indifferent, enveloped them in its lethal embrace. On the eve of the attack, the configuration of the Roman troops was the worst possible. Dispersed columns, isolated units, worn equipment, exhausted soldiers, and leaders unprepared to face the type of warfare that awaited them. Arminius, on the other hand, had carefully arranged the positioning of his forces, distributed at multiple points along the route, ready to attack simultaneously and prevent any possibility of reorganization or retreat. This moment, the march to Teutoburg, represents in Roman military history a classic example of how overconfidence, underestimation of the enemy, and disregard for the characteristics of the terrain can transform an apparently routine campaign into an irreparable disaster. Rome, which until then believed that its presence in Germania was merely a matter of time and persistence, was about to learn, in a brutal and bloody manner, the limits of its power. Thus, enveloped by the cold mist of the forest and the damp scent of moss and dead leaves, Varus's legions continued their path. They did not know that just a few steps ahead, death, dishonor, and eternity awaited them. For although their bodies would be lost in the mud of Teutoburg, their defeat would be inscribed forever in the annals of Rome as one of the most painful and revealing episodes of its long history. When the first attack erupted from the dense forest, enveloped by the howls of Germanic warriors and the clash of thrown spears and arrows, the extended and disjointed Roman column barely had time to comprehend that it had entered a deadly trap. Arminius's plan revealed itself in all its strategic perfection: to use the terrain and climate to nullify the traditional strength of the Roman legions, separating, weakening, and finally annihilating them in successive blows of unrestrained violence. The first day was marked by absolute chaos. Under a cold and relentless rain, the Germans emerged from all sides, descending from ravines, emerging from pits and hidden clearings, attacking with short spears, broad swords, and heavy axes. The legionaries, burdened by their soaked armor and the weight of their shields, desperately tried to form defensive cohorts, but the uneven terrain and lack of space prevented cohesion. Each detachment fought in isolation, while the shouts of command were lost amid the confusion of the trees and the cacophony of war filling the air. The Roman officers, aware of the need to resist and reorganize the troops, ordered tactical withdrawals to more open areas, but such areas did not exist. The Teutoburg forest, with its succession of swamps, ravines, and treacherous routes, made any maneuver an almost impossible task. Many soldiers sank into the mire. Others fell beneath trees previously cut down by the Germans to block the advance and divide the columns. The supply wagons, bogged down, became insurmountable obstacles or were set ablaze, sending thick smoke over the already murky scene. As the day wore on and night fell over the forest, the survivors sought improvised shelter, erecting palisades of shields and rudimentary fortifications from trunks and branches. However, not even night brought relief. The Germans maintained the siege, harassing the Romans with intermittent attacks, intimidating shouts, and volleys of projectiles. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion began to erode not only the legionaries' bodies, but also their spirit. On the second day, the situation deteriorated even further. Attempting to break the siege, Varus commanded a desperate march westward, hoping to reach one of the Roman forts, or at least find more favorable ground. But the trail they followed had been previously prepared by Arminius. Felled trees blocked the path, and narrow passages between ravines funneled the Romans into killing zones where Germanic warriors lay in ambush, ready to strike with lethal precision. The massacre proceeded systematically. The weight of Roman armor designed for regimented combat became an unbearable burden in the deep mud. Many soldiers abandoned their shields and helmets in a desperate attempt to gain mobility, only to become even more vulnerable to the blows of the Germans, who fought without armor, in light garments, with absolute knowledge of the terrain. Roman numerical superiority, so effective in open fields, turned into a logistical disaster. Too many men, too little space, and no chance of escape. The losses mounted catastrophically. Tribunes and centurions fell alongside ordinary legionaries, while Governor Varus, stunned, found himself powerless before the magnitude of the disaster. Some detachments managed to form small pockets of resistance, heroically repelling localized attacks, but they were quickly surrounded and mercilessly exterminated. The third day brought no hope. Hunger sapped the survivors' strength, cold paralyzed their limbs, and the mud swallowed their bodies like a tomb. Morale, once sustained by the indestructible discipline of the legions, was in shreds. Many soldiers, aware that there was no escape, chose suicide over capture or death at the hands of the enemy. Others deserted in desperate attempts to flee, only to be hunted down and killed by Germanic patrols. Arminius, conducting the siege with surgical precision, maintained constant pressure, avoiding a massive frontal assault that might open gaps for a mass withdrawal. His objective was clear, not merely to defeat but to obliterate the legions completely, eliminating any possibility of regrouping or resistance. Roman humiliation had to be total and irreversible. When at last the final nucleus of resistance was crushed and the war cries ceased, only the echoes of the massacre remained, along with the unburied bodies scattered throughout the silent forest. Publius Quinctilius Varus, seeing the inevitability of defeat, chose death by his own hand, following the Roman tradition of avoiding capture and humiliation. Many officers did the same, ending their lives beside the standards they could no longer protect. Legions 17, Zetit, and 19 ceased to exist in that forest, not only as military units, but as symbols of Roman invincibility. They would never be reconstituted, and their numbers would disappear forever from legionary rolls, a silent tribute to the magnitude of the defeat. The Teutoburg forest, once an anonymous space on the imperial map, thus became the setting for one of the greatest disasters in Roman military history, and the place where an empire's pride met its limits in the fierce resistance of a people who refused to be conquered. When the massacre reached its climax, and the last hope of resistance dissolved amid the mud and blood of the Teutoburg forest, Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor and supreme commander of the Roman forces in Germania, made the decision that for many Roman officers was the only honorable choice: suicide. As ancient chroniclers reported, Varus, realizing that defeat was irreversible and that capture would mean personal and political humiliation, fell upon his own sword, ending his life on the very battlefield where the legions under his command were being extinguished. Thus fell not only a man but also the symbol of Roman presence and authority in that region. Around Varus, the destruction was complete. Legions 17, 48 and 99, veteran units that had participated in previous campaigns and upheld the tradition of Roman discipline and military glory, were annihilated with no possibility of reorganization or escape. The legionary standards, silver and gold eagles, the highest symbol of Roman military honor, fell into Germanic hands, a loss considered by Roman culture even graver than human destruction itself. Arminius, who understood deeply the importance of these symbols, made a point of capturing them as trophies, displaying them to reinforce his victory and further humiliate his adversary. The end of the legions at Teutoburg was not merely a tactical defeat, but a complete dissolution of military structures that until then had seemed indestructible. Each Roman legion was more than a gathering of soldiers. It represented a community, a tradition, a collective memory forged through campaigns and ceremonies, perpetuated by shared rites and symbols. The total loss of these three legions thus meant a brutal rupture with that continuity, an institutional trauma for the Roman army and the empire itself. Few managed to escape the carnage. It is estimated that thousands of soldiers fell, while others were captured, and in many cases ritually sacrificed by the Germans as offerings to the gods of the forests and battles. Some prisoners were kept as slaves or forcibly integrated into the victorious tribes, disappearing forever from Roman records. The violence of the massacre spared not even the civilians who accompanied the march. Merchants, artisans, families of legionaries, and enslaved individuals were killed or captured, further magnifying the human dimension of the tragedy. The absolute destruction of legions 17, 14, and 19 had such a profound impact on Rome that subsequently these units would never be reconstituted. The usual practice after defeats was to rebuild the legion, restoring its name and tradition as an act of resilience. However, in this case, the defeat was so devastating and symbolic that the memory of these legions was banished from military order. Their numbers became cursed, evoking a failure that Rome preferred to bury in memory, like a ghost haunting the imperial invincibility. Varus's suicide and the annihilation of his legions marked the final point of a campaign that, months earlier, had been conceived as yet another step in imperial expansion, but which suddenly revealed itself as the insurmountable limit of Roman power east of the Rhine. The episode exposed the vulnerability of the Roman military machine when faced with enemies capable of understanding and exploiting its flaws. It showed that even the most disciplined and well-equipped army, by underestimating the terrain, culture, and strategy of peoples considered barbaric, could be reduced to rubble. In Rome, the news of the catastrophe would take days to arrive, but when it did, it would spread a wave of terror and unprecedented mourning. Meanwhile, in the Teutoburg forest, the bodies of soldiers and officers lay unburied, mingled with the mud, fragments of broken weapons and torn standards, silent witnesses to one of the most terrible defeats in Roman military history, an irrevocable milestone in the trajectory of the empire and the geography of its power. When, weeks after the massacre, the first fragmented reports about the complete destruction of Varus's legions reached Rome, the impact was profound and devastating. The Eternal City, accustomed to celebrating triumphs and victories, plunged into a state of perplexity, mourning, and fear. Never since the humiliating defeats of the Punic Wars had Rome experienced a military tragedy of such magnitude. The loss of 3 entire legions, the captured standards, the death of the governor and his officers, and the palpable threat of a Germanic offensive beyond the Rhine generated an uproar that swept through all layers of Roman society, from the Senate to the people, from veteran soldiers to merchants, from aristocratic matrons to enslaved individuals. At the heart of this shock was Augustus, the emperor who had dedicated his life to consolidating the peace and stability of the empire. The news of the defeat struck him not only as head of state, but as a man. According to Suetonius, upon receiving the official confirmation of the catastrophe, Augustus sank into a deep depression, refusing to cut his hair or trim his beard for months. and was reportedly heard repeatedly crying out in despair, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." This phrase, immortalized by historians, became the symbol of imperial lament in the face of an irreparable loss and an unprecedented public humiliation. The Senate's reaction was immediate and pragmatic. Days of public mourning were decreed, celebrations suspended, and defenses along the Rhine frontier reinforced. The specter of a Germanic invasion terrified politicians and military leaders, who feared that Arminius's success would inspire new rebellions and barbarian incursions not only in Germania, but across the entire northern frontier of the empire. Militarily, Augustus ordered the urgent mobilization of additional troops, dispatching reinforcements from legions stationed in Gaul, Pannonia, and other nearby provinces. Tiberius, Augustus's adopted son and political heir, was tasked with stabilizing the frontier and preventing any Germanic advance toward Roman provinces. This effort included rebuilding destroyed forts, fortifying new positions, and intensifying patrols along the Rhine. But the defeat at Teutoburg was not merely a military setback, it was a symbolic blow that deeply shook Rome's confidence in its own invincibility. Since the time of Caesar, the legions had advanced into barbarian lands with a mixture of brutality and efficiency, establishing the idea that Roman expansion was inexorable, a force of political nature. The complete annihilation of 3 legions by the cunning of a barbarian leader demonstrated brutally that Roman power had limits, and that those limits could be exploited by those who understood its vulnerabilities. Moreover, the catastrophe directly impacted Roman foreign policy. From then on, the idea of transforming Germania into a fully integrated province was largely abandoned. The empire, once driven by an aggressive expansionist policy, began to adopt a more defensive and cautious stance regarding territories east of the Rhine. The defeat at Teutoburg thus represented a watershed moment in imperial strategy, from an empire that advanced relentlessly to one that began to consolidate and protect its frontiers, erecting fortified lines that would define the boundaries of the Roman world for centuries to come. On a psychological level, the defeat fed a lasting fear of the Germanic peoples. The image of the untamable barbarian, resistant to Roman civilization, took on even darker contours. Arminius, once seen as a loyal ally, transformed into the paradigm of the barbarian traitor, dangerous precisely because he intimately knew Roman methods and mentality. The terror generated by the tragedy of Teutoburg also resonated in the arts and literature of the time. Poets and chroniclers reflected on the fragility of human fortune and the unpredictability of power. The realization that even Rome, mistress of the world, could be defeated, revealed itself as a bitter but essential lesson for understanding the limits of the empire itself. In the intimacy of the Palatine Palace, Augustus aged under the shadow of this defeat, conscious that the dream of expanding the empire beyond the Rhine was shattered, and that, from Teutoburg onward, Rome could no longer advance without first confronting the ghosts left behind in the Germanic forest. Thus, between the emperor's lament and the citizens' panic, a new era was forged, one in which Rome would turn inward, consolidating what it had conquered, but carrying forever the scar left by the silent trees and the bloodied trails of Teutoburg. Arminius's victory in the Teutoburg forest represented for the Germanic tribes more than just a military triumph. It was the consecration of an ideal of freedom, the definitive breaking of the chains that Rome sought to impose upon Germania. For the first time, a barbarian army had not only repelled but completely destroyed 3 Roman legions, shattering the myth of invincibility that for centuries had sustained imperial expansion. With the massacre of Varus's legions, Germania ceased to be a potential province and became a free territory where Roman presence would never again be fully established. Arminius, the strategist behind the ambush, emerged as the ultimate hero of Germanic resistance. For the tribes that had lived for decades under the pressure of garrisons and the arrogance of Roman administrators, his victory symbolized not only the liberation of their territories, but also the validation of a way of life incompatible with imperial order. The forest, the artisan-forged weapons, the ancestral gods, and the tribal bonds had prevailed over the roads, the uniformed legions, Roman law, and the imperatives of Romanization. With this victory, an unprecedented sense of unity was consolidated among the Germanic peoples. Traditionally, rival tribes recognized, at least temporarily, that cooperation and collective resistance were the only guarantees against new attempts at subjugation. The name of Arminius circulated among the clans as that of a liberator, a warrior sage who had known how to interpret the signs of the times and act at the precise moment to ensure Germania's survival as an autonomous space in the face of the Roman Empire. For Rome, the defeat at Teutoburg was not merely a military loss, but a strategic redefinition. The Rhine, once viewed as a starting point for future campaigns toward the Elbe and the Germanic interior, was now conceived as a defensive barrier, a frontier to be consolidated and protected. Augustus's project to Romanize Germania, transforming it into yet another province of the empire, was abandoned. In its place emerged a new imperial policy marked by containment, the fortification of boundaries, and the tacit acceptance that not all regions could or should be integrated. This political and military redirection materialized over the following years in the construction and reinforcement of the Limes Germanicus, a complex system of forts, watchtowers, ditches, and natural barriers that demarcated the physical and symbolic separation between the Roman world and the Germanic world. This line, which would extend for hundreds of kilometers, was not only a military device but also a marker of Rome's renunciation of unlimited expansion and an implicit acknowledgement of the power of cultures that resisted assimilation. While Germania celebrated its freedom, the implications for the empire were profound. The defeat forced Rome to rethink its strategies of cultural integration and to admit that the model of conquest and acculturation, so successful in Gaul and Hispania, encountered in Germania an insurmountable obstacle. Germanic resistance was not merely military, but civilizational, a categorical refusal of urbanization, imperial law, political centralization, and the dissolution of tribal identities. Arminius, aware of the scope of his victory, sought to seize the moment to further strengthen cohesion among the tribes. He convened assemblies, proposed lasting alliances, and attempted to institutionalize a common front against any future Roman offensive. However, the very decentralized nature of Germanic society made the consolidation of a stable unity difficult. Ancient rivalries, territorial disputes, and dynastic conflicts soon resurfaced, demonstrating that, although the victory at Teutoburg had halted Roman expansion, Germania would not transform into a unified federation under the leadership of Arminius or anyone else. Even so, the significance of the victory was immense. For the first time, Rome had encountered a people who, instead of being absorbed, imposed clear limits on imperial advance. The Teutoburg forest thus became not only a cemetery of legions, but a geopolitical landmark, a space of memory and resistance that redefined the contours of power in Europe. In the long term, this Germanic victory contributed to shaping the very configuration of the continent. The separation between the Roman Latin world and the Germanic world would become one of the fundamental traits of subsequent European history, influencing the formation of medieval kingdoms, barbarian migrations, and centuries later, the national myths and ideologies that would make Arminius, known in German tradition as Hermann, an icon of freedom against foreign domination. Meanwhile, Rome, wounded but resilient, turned to consolidating its domains, aware that Germania, free and untamed, would remain beyond the reach of its legions, a permanent reminder that not even the greatest of empires can extend indefinitely without encountering resistance commensurate with its ambition. The defeat at Teutoburg, though devastating, did not mark the end of the Roman military presence in Germania. The pain and humiliation inflicted by the destruction of the legions and the capture of their standards cast over the empire not only mourning, but also a burning desire for vengeance. Rome never passively accepted an affront of such magnitude. The response would come under the command of Germanicus Julius Caesar, nephew of Tiberius, a charismatic general admired by his troops and heir to a military tradition that linked him directly to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Appointed to restore Roman honor and suppress any new Germanic threat, Germanicus undertook between the years 14 and 16. After Christ, a series of memorable campaigns in the region beyond the Rhine. The mission was twofold: to punish the peoples who had participated in the ambush, and above all to recover the legionary standards, lost, whose absence represented an open wound in the pride of the Roman army. With a carefully organized force, composed of veteran legions, auxiliary troops, and a powerful cavalry, Germanicus crossed the Rhine, entering Germania with a mixture of vengeful fury and refined military strategy. His advance was meticulous, taking advantage of accumulated knowledge about the hostile terrain and employing tactics designed to avoid the mistakes made by Varus years before. Unlike his predecessor, Germanicus reinforced the vanguards, secured adequate supplies, and employed the mobility of his troops to avoid ambushes. Throughout his campaigns, Germanicus faced fierce battles against various Germanic tribes, which, though inspired by Arminius's victory, could not replicate the same level of cohesion and military effectiveness. Among the most emblematic confrontations was the Battle of Viso, fought on the banks of the Weser River, where Roman forces defeated a Germanic army under Arminius himself. The victory, hard won, represented not only a tactical success, but also a moral blow against the hero of Germanic resistance. In another remarkable operation, Germanicus organized an expedition to visit and bury the bodies of the legionaries killed in the Teutoburg forest. The scene was described with sorrow by chroniclers. Roman soldiers, recognizing bones and fragments of armor scattered across the ground, erected improvised graves, burned incense, and performed funeral rites in honor of their fallen comrades. Germanicus himself, moved, personally oversaw the ceremonies, transforming the act into a moment of purification and reaffirmation of Roman dignity. The symbolic pinnacle of Germanicus's campaign was the recovery of the lost standards. Through battles and negotiations, the Romans succeeded in reclaiming one by one the sacred emblems that had been taken by the Germans after Varus's defeat. These standards, more than mere military artifacts, were considered living representations of the legion's honor and spirit. Their recovery not only restored the prestige of the annihilated legions, but also signaled to the world and to Rome that the empire, even wounded, would never cease to reclaim its dignity. Despite these victories, Germanicus was confronted with the reality that the complete conquest of Germania was impractical. The logistical difficulties, the relentless resistance of the tribes, and the weariness of the troops indicated that a lasting occupation would require an unsustainable human and material cost. Additionally, political pressures in Rome, associated with Emperor Tiberius's jealousy and distrust of Germanicus's growing popularity, resulted in the order for his return. Thus, the Roman attempt to resume the project of deep expansion into Germania came to an end. Germanicus's legacy, however, was immense. He restored the army's confidence, partially avenged the defeat at Teutoburg, and recovered the standards that symbolized the soul of the legions. His campaign was recorded as an example of military virtue, courage, and discipline in the face of extreme adversity. Roman vengeance, therefore, did not culminate in the reconquest of Germania, but in the reaffirmation that, even in the face of one of the most terrible defeats in its history, the empire never left an outrage unpunished. Rome could be wounded, but not destroyed. And even when it retreated, it did so with the pride of those who knew that its presence would continue to shape the destiny of nations and peoples for centuries to come. The Battle of Teutoburg was not merely a military event, but a profound landmark in the political, strategic, and symbolic consciousness of Rome. Its memory echoed far beyond the blood-soaked fields of Germania, infiltrating military thought, literature, imperial administration, and above all, the way Rome conceived the limits of its own power. Across the centuries, Teutoburg remained as a silent spectre, reminding successive emperors that not even the greatest empire of the ancient world was invulnerable. From a strategic standpoint, Varus's defeat cemented a fundamental shift in imperial policy. The transition from aggressive expansionism to a posture of defense and containment. The idea that Rome could indefinitely extend its borders, assimilating peoples and territories in a continuous process of Romanization, was called into question. In its place, the vision took hold that it was necessary to define and protect clear boundaries, structuring the empire not as a perpetually expanding organism, but as a stabilized entity, aware of its frontiers and dedicated to their maintenance. This new conception materialized in the construction of the Limes Germanicus, a monumental system of fortifications, walls, ditches, and garrisons that snaked along the Rhine and Danube, definitively separating the Roman world from the Germanic one. The frontiers ceased to be porous and dynamic lines, transforming instead into architectural and symbolic barriers that delimited not only geographic space, but also the cultural, legal, and political universe of the empire. The memory of Teutoburg also shaped the Roman imaginary, regarding the Germanic peoples. Once seen as distant barbarians, potential allies or subjects to be Romanized, the Germans came to be conceived as permanent, irreducible, and dangerous enemies. Narratives about their ferocity, cunning, and resistance were amplified by Roman writers and historians, transforming the defeat into a cautionary myth, a constant reminder of the need for vigilance, discipline, and respect for the particularities of one's adversaries. Tacitus, in his work, Germania, written decades after the battle, described the Germanic peoples with a blend of admiration and fear, highlighting their warrior virtues, their simplicity of customs, and their unyielding freedom. This perspective, shaped in part by the tragedy of Teutoburg, contributed to crystallizing a dual image. The Germans were at once the radical other and the mirror reflecting aspects that Rome both feared and desired: brute strength, indomitable courage, resistance to luxury and corruption. Politically, the memory of the defeat generated an institutional culture marked by caution. Generals and administrators operating in frontier regions became more prudent in their campaigns, aware that imprudence and underestimation of the enemy could lead to similar disasters. The example of Varus became paradigmatic. Administrative arrogance, blind trust in apparent alliances, and disregard for terrain knowledge were henceforth considered fatal flaws. Furthermore, Teutoburg had a profound impact on the imperial conception of power and fortune. The notion that Fortuna, so celebrated by the Romans as a goddess favoring the bold, could at times abandon even the most powerful, gained new strength. Poets and philosophers reflected on the instability of human fortune, the necessity of prudence, and the intrinsic limits of any political project that aspired to eternity. In military ceremonies, the remembrance of the lost legions became a silent invocation to discipline and vigilance. Although their designations, 17 solitith and 19th, were never reused, as a gesture of mourning and respect, their fate was evoked as a perennial lesson for all legions: the price of inattention, arrogance, and underestimation of the adversary. Finally, the memory of Teutoburg also permeated the post-Roman European imagination, being revived and reinterpreted in different historical contexts. For 19th century German nationalists, Arminius, or Hermann, became a symbol of resistance against foreign domination, culminating in the construction of the imposing Hermannsdenkmal in the region of Westphalia, commemorating his victory and celebrating the Germanic spirit of freedom. Thus, the Battle of Teutoburg transcended the boundaries of its time, inscribing itself not only in the history of Rome, but in the long narrative of Europe as an episode where glory and disgrace, heroism and tragedy, power and its limits intertwined. In the silent shadow of the Germanic forests, Rome learned that even the vastest empires are made of flesh, of fallible men, and of stories that, once written in blood, can never be erased. After the monumental victory in the Teutoburg forest, Arminius was celebrated among the Germanic tribes as the liberator, the man who challenged and defeated Rome, breaking the imperial yoke that threatened to definitively subjugate Germania. His name echoed through the forests and rivers of the north as a synonym for resistance and courage, and for a brief moment, what had never before seemed possible appeared within reach: the unification of the Germanic peoples under a single leadership, capable not only of repelling the Romans, but also of establishing a new political order among the clans, until then divided by centuries-old rivalries. However, military triumph did not translate into the political cohesion that Arminius so fervently desired. The nature of Germanic societies, strongly rooted in the autonomy of clans, loyalty to local leaders, and resistance to centralized power, imposed insurmountable limits on the project of unification. Although Arminius's prestige was immense, he lacked the institutional mechanisms or administrative structures that had, for instance, allowed Rome to transform conquered peoples into provinces integrated into its imperial apparatus. Instead, the alliances that had made victory over Varus's legions possible began to fragment as soon as the immediate threat vanished. Some tribal chiefs, satisfied with Rome's expulsion, saw no need to continue military or political campaigns beyond their traditional territories. Others distrusted Arminius's intentions, fearing that the hero might transform into a tyrant, eager to subject the tribes to his personal authority, ironically reproducing the very model of centralization against which they had fought. The years following the victory were, for Arminius, marked by constant internal conflicts. While he continued to lead defensive campaigns and sporadic battles against Roman incursions, he found himself increasingly embroiled in disputes with other Germanic leaders, especially Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni, who had built a powerful tribal confederation in Bohemia. The rivalry between the two prevented any serious attempt at articulating a unified Germanic bloc. The confrontation between Arminius and Maroboduus culminated in a series of battles and political maneuvers that, although they did not result in mutual destruction, further fragmented the Germanic political fabric. The inability to overcome internal divisions revealed itself as the greatest obstacle to Arminius's dream of transforming his military victory into a lasting political legacy. Moreover, the very family and blood ties that sustained Arminius's power began to crumble. Tensions with members of his own lineage and with other Cheruscan nobles escalated to a critical point. Finally, in 21, after Christ, only 12 years after the glorious victory at Teutoburg, Arminius was assassinated by close relatives, victims of both fear and ambition, unable to bear the concentration of prestige and influence that he represented. Thus ended the life of the man who had inflicted upon Rome one of its greatest defeats. His death was silent and without glory, contrasting dramatically with the roar of his military triumph. Yet, although he failed to unify Germania or establish a lasting political entity, Arminius's legacy transcended his immediate existence. He remained across the centuries as the ultimate symbol of Germanic resistance to foreign domination, an icon of tribal freedom and the struggle against imperial power. For Rome, Arminius's death represented the tacit relief of a formidable military obstacle, but it did not erase the trauma of Teutoburg. Even with the hero's disappearance, Germania remained beyond the reach of the legions, an untamed space that would continue to influence the empire's frontier policies until its decline. Thus, Arminius's trajectory after Teutoburg was marked by historical irony. The man who defeated Rome could not overcome the centrifugal forces of his own culture. His victory was total on the battlefield, but incomplete in the political arena. Yet the echo of his name, whispered among the trees of the Germanic forests, was never silenced, and centuries later, it would be resurrected as myth and legend, inspiring future generations to remember that, in the face of colossal empires, the will to resist can, at times, bend even the mightiest of armies. For centuries, the exact location of the Battle of Teutoburg remained shrouded in mystery. Surrounded by speculation, legends, and contradictory narratives, ancient chroniclers such as Tacitus and Cassius Dio described the horrors of the ambush, but left only vague indications about the precise setting of the massacre. The forest, with its vastness and mutability over the centuries, seemed to have forever swallowed the material traces of the disaster that shook Rome. Yet at the end of the 20th century, patience, science, and human perseverance broke that millennial silence. At Calcries, a hill in the Lower Saxony region of northern Germany, archaeologists began to uncover, layer by layer, the concrete traces of the legendary battle. The discoveries began in the 1980s, when during systematic excavations, unequivocal artifacts of Roman presence emerged. Coins bearing the seal of Augustus, fragments of legionary armor, pilum spearheads, hobnails from military sandals, the caligae, and personal objects such as buckles, knives, and even medical instruments. But above all, the quantity of human and animal bones, scattered in a pattern, suggesting not just a military occupation, but a battlefield and site of death on a massive scale, captured attention. The topographical configuration of Calcries corresponds with unsettling precision to ancient descriptions, a narrow passage between a steep hill and a treacherous swamp, a natural funnel ideal for an ambush. There the legions, compressed between the elevated terrain and the waterlogged ground, would have lost their mobility, becoming easy targets for successive attacks by the Germanic forces. The discovery of a long turf and sand wall, rudimentarily constructed, further suggested prior preparation of the terrain by the attackers, reinforcing the idea that Arminius had meticulously planned the ambush. Archaeological studies also revealed evidence of the desperate struggle waged by the legionaries. Many of the skeletons found display marks of violent blows, fractures, and puncture wounds, indicating hand-to-hand combat amid the chaos of the forest. Moreover, The absence of organized burials, typical of Roman battlefields, confirms the hasty and tragic abandonment of the bodies, left at the mercy of nature and time, just as ancient historians reported. In 2016, a priceless discovery crowned decades of investigation. A fragment of an iron mask, part of a Roman ceremonial helmet, finely crafted and artistically adorned, was found in the vicinity of Calcrease. The object, a symbol of Roman military pomp and discipline, contrasts poignantly with the tragic fate of its bearer, reinforcing the human and dramatic dimension of the defeat. Today, Calcrease is considered, with broad academic consensus, the site of the Battle of Teutoburg. A museum and archaeological park have been established there to preserve and exhibit the recovered artifacts, offering the public a unique immersion in history. Carefully marked trails guide visitors through the landscape where, over 2,000 years ago, the ground was stained with Roman blood, and the course of European history suffered an irreversible inflection. More than merely confirming the veracity of ancient accounts, the archaeology of Calcrease offers a tangible perspective on the human dimension of the battle. Every exhumed object, a forgotten coin, a broken blade, a fractured bone, is a silent trace of the lives extinguished there, of the hopes crushed, and of the fears that even today reverberate in collective memory. The excavation of Calcrease also exemplifies the importance of archaeology as a science of patience and reconstruction. For centuries, the Battle of Teutoburg was known only through the words of chroniclers, subject to interpretation and myth-making. Now, the earth itself speaks, revealing what even Roman imperial propaganda could not bury, the material proof that, in that forest, Rome met its limits and Germania found its freedom. Thus, Calcrease remains not only as an archaeological site, but as a silent and eternal memorial, where the past bleeds into the present, reminding all that history does not live solely in books, but rests, hidden, beneath every inch of earth we dare to excavate. Over the centuries, the Battle of Teutoburg transcended its original meaning, ceasing to be merely a military episode from the early 1st century and transforming into a polysemic symbol, constantly reinterpreted by generations who, from time to time, rediscovered and reshaped it according to the political, cultural, and ideological needs of their era. If, for Rome, Teutoburg had been the mark of a humiliating defeat, for Germania and later for modern Germany, it became a banner of resistance, pride, and national identity. The process of mythologizing the battle reached its zenith in the 19th century during the period of German unification. The figure of one Arminius, Latinized by Roman chroniclers and rebranded in the Germanic imagination as Hermann, was elevated to the status of national hero, a prototype of German leadership who, centuries earlier, had already demonstrated the capacity of the Germanic people to resist foreign domination. In this context, the Battle of Teutoburg came to be interpreted as the embryo of the German nation, a foundational moment when, for the first time, the Germans, though tribally fragmented, united against a common enemy and triumphed. This symbolic appropriation materialized monumentally in the Hermannsdenkmal, the Colossus of Hermann, inaugurated in 1875 near Detmold, close to the site traditionally associated with the battle. The statue, over 26 meters tall, represents Arminius raising a triumphant sword, gazing westward towards France, a deliberate choice linking the ancient Germanic victory to a contemporary message of national affirmation against Germany's historical enemies. The inscription at the base of the monument reinforced the nationalist purpose, the unity of the Germans, my strength, the freedom of Germania. The Hermannsdenkmal became one of the most important sites of patriotic pilgrimage in Germany, especially during the height of German nationalism, serving as a stage for ceremonies, speeches, and celebrations that exalted resistance to foreign domination and the cultural superiority of the Germans. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the memory of Teutoburg was thus politicized and instrumentalized, inserted into discourses that justified the unification of the Reich, German colonial expansion, and later, the militarist narratives that preceded the two world wars. Beyond political use, the Battle of Teutoburg and the figure of Arminius inspired a vast artistic and literary production. Romantic painters depicted heroic scenes of the ambush, sculptors immortalized the profile of the Germanic leader, and playwrights wrote dramas extolling his courage and cunning. Poets like Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock and Heinrich von Kleist transformed Arminius into a heroic archetype, incorporating him into the literary pantheon of Germany. In the 20th century, with the advent of cinematography, the battle found a new medium of expression. Various audiovisual productions, both in Germany and abroad, portrayed the confrontation, sometimes as an epic struggle for freedom, other times as a human tragedy of universal proportions. The representations varied according to the political and cultural context of each era. During the Nazi regime, for instance, Arminius was promoted as an example of racial purity and natural leadership, an ideological distortion that sought to root expansionist policy in the mythical soil of Teutoburg. After the Second World War, however, the approach to the battle in collective memory underwent a significant revision. Excessively nationalist interpretations were criticized and, in many cases, rejected, giving way to more complex and nuanced understandings. Historians, writers, and filmmakers began to explore Teutoburg not only as a symbol of resistance, but also as a study on the ambiguities of war, the consequences of imperial expansion, and the limits of hegemonic power. In the academic field, the battle became the subject of interdisciplinary investigation, involving historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and cultural scholars. The archaeological discoveries at Kalkries fueled documentaries and historical reconstructions that, aided by technologies such as 3D modeling and augmented reality, allowed the public to visualize the dynamics of the confrontation with unprecedented realism. Thus, in modern culture, Teutoburg remains a powerful palimpsest, a narrative about freedom, betrayal, victory, and loss, a lesson about the limits of imperialism and the unforeseen forces of history, an example of how events of the past can be continually rewritten, appropriated, and resignified in light of the passions and interests of the present. Today, when visitors walk the silent trails of Kalkries or contemplate the raised sword of the Hermannsdenkmal, they are not merely observing the remnants of an ancient battle, but also the indelible traces of human memory, which transforms historical facts into enduring myths, capable of shaping identities and inspiring narratives for countless generations. The Battle of Teutoburg remains, to this day, one of history's most powerful warnings about the limits of imperial power. There, in the heart of the dense Germanic forest, Rome encountered what it rarely acknowledged: the impossibility of extending its hegemony beyond certain geographical, cultural, and human boundaries. It was not numerical superiority, architectural splendor, military engineering, or legionary discipline that determined the fate of that confrontation, but rather Arminius's profound understanding that nature, culture, and the will to resist can overcome even the vastest of empires. Teutoburg symbolically marked the beginning of Rome's recognition that infinite expansion was not only unfeasible, but also undesirable. After centuries of victorious campaigns, Rome was forced to redefine its very conception of frontier. The world, until then perceived as a succession of territories to be conquered and Romanized, revealed itself there in all its complexity and resistance. The Rhine was consolidated after the disaster as a definitive barrier, no longer an obstacle to be crossed, but a limit to be respected and defended. This paradigm shift influenced not only military decisions, but also the political philosophy of the empire. From Teutoburg onward, Rome turned more intensely inward, towards internal administration, the strengthening of its borders, and the cultivation of stability, in detriment to the expansionist campaigns that had characterized the Republican and early Principate periods. The construction of fortifications, such as the Limes Germanicus, came to express not weakness, but imperial maturity, the conscious acceptance of the contours that would define the maximum extent of the Romanitas. From a historical perspective, the defeat was also a victory for cultural diversity. Teutoburg ensured that Germania remained, for centuries, an alternative space where values, beliefs, and practices distinct from those of Rome could flourish. Thus, the clash was not only between armies, but between worldviews. On one side, the urban, hierarchical, codified civilization of the empire; on the other, tribal fluidity, ancestral ties to the land, and resistance to political centralization. The episode also revealed the ambiguities inherent in Roman imperial policy. The practice of co-opting local elites, as was done with Arminius, exposed the ever-present risk that such alliances could turn into devastating betrayals. Rome learned with blood and pain that imposed loyalty can be as fragile as a blade of iron corroded by the rust of time. Teutoburg thus became an enduring symbol of the consequences of imperial arrogance, of the disregard for the capacities of the other, and of blind trust in cultural and military superiority. The image of annihilated legions, fallen standards, unburied soldiers, and the governor who, unable to survive his own dishonor, fell upon his sword, encapsulates the tragic dimension of Rome's imperial venture. Yet Rome's greatness was measured not only by its victories, but also by its capacity to transform defeats into lessons. Augustus's lament, echoing through the marble palaces, Quintilius Varus, "Give me back my legions," was not merely an expression of grief, but also, perhaps for the first time in imperial history, an acknowledgement that Rome was human, subject to the same vicissitudes that befall all peoples and nations. Across the long timeline, the Battle of Teutoburg illuminates the universal tension between the desire for expansion and the necessity of containment, between power and its limits, between empire and resistance. Far from being merely a localized event, it embodies a recurring archetype, the moment when absolute power meets its insurmountable barrier, and the course of history is irrevocably altered. Thus, in concluding the narrative of this battle, one does not merely celebrate Arminius's victory or lament Rome's defeat, but contemplates, with reverence, the complexity of the forces that move human history. Among silent trees and deep roots, the forest of Teutoburg remains even today as a natural monument to resistance, to memory, and to the eternal lesson that even the mightiest of empires must one day confront the limits of its own ambition.